Welcome back to our channel, where we dive deep into the extraordinary lives of some of the most intriguing and controversial figures in history. Today, we have a story that might just be the most fascinating one yet. Meet Gregory Scarpa, a man who lived a double life as both a feared member of the Colombo Mafia family and a secret informant for the FBI. His connections ran so deep that the agents supervising him became his allies, aiding him in evading prison and continuing his illicit activities. Get ready for a journey into the unbelievable and complex world of Gregory Scarpa. Gregory Scarpa was selective in leaking information and distorting facts, using these tactics to eliminate those who hindered him and systematically increase his power. Some even believe that Scarpa was the great cardinal of the family, pulling the strings and controlling everything from behind the scenes. He started wars, killed, and ordered the deaths of dozens. He turned his son into a killer, officially allowed his wife to have a lover, and then turned him into a killer as well. Even near the end of his life, when he was reduced to a walking skeleton due to illness, Scarpa's influence remained formidable. Despite being ravaged by advancing AIDS, he still rode around the city, shooting his enemies. How's that for a synopsis? Want a more detailed story? Then meet Gregory Scarpa, a man on the other side of the law. Not much is known about Scarpa's early life. He was born in 1928 in Bensonhurst, a working-class neighborhood in Brooklyn, to a poor Italian-American family. There are also rumors that he was born in Italy and moved to the United States with his parents at an early age. However, I will stick to the first version for this story. From a book written with the participation of his son, we learn that in 1949, Gregory Scarpa married Connie Forrest, with whom he had a son, Gregory Scarpa Jr., who will also feature in our narrative today. By the early 1950s, when his son was born, Scarpa was already involved in crime, as evidenced by his arrest for burglary. It was also during the 1950s that he appears to have become a member of the Mafia family we now know as the Colombo family. Its boss, at the time, was Joe Profassi, who had a conflict with the Gallo brothers in the 1960s, which I will delve into further. I talked about this in more detail in my video about the Gallo brothers. At that time, Scarpa was close to Calogero Lo Cicero, better known as Charlie the Sige, who was then a consigliere. Realizing that the cancer-stricken Joe Profasci wouldn't last long, Charlie began making plans to take over the family. However, he was overtaken by Joseph Magliocco, who became boss after Profasci's death and demoted Charlie to captain. Charlie then started plotting against Magliocco. Scarpa was even contracted to kill Magliocco, but Charlie later called it off for some reason. In the end, Charlie never gained power, and Joe Colombo became the boss. Scarpa, who had supported his mentor, played a part in Charlie's downfall when it became clear that his ascension wouldn't happen. More on that later. At this time, Greg Scarpa, sir, was working as an informant. In 1960, he was arrested for armed robbery, and FBI agents began recruiting him. By the fall of 1961, Scarpa had surrendered and agreed to cooperate. He became a confidential informant and received regular payments for his work. Scarpa would receive more than $150,000 from the authorities during his time as an informant, which is over $1 million in today's equivalent. From that moment on, Greg kept the FBI informed about everything happening inside the American Mafia, especially within the Colombo family. A couple of years before Joe Valachi appeared before the Senate and revealed the inner workings of the Mafia to the entire country, he had already done so privately in conversations with agents. There is even a version that says all the information Valachi shared was actually given to him by FBI agents. Proponents of this version believe that a low-ranking Mafia member like Valachi simply could not have known so much, and that through him, Edgar Hoover wanted to tell the country everything the FBI had learned about Cosa Nostra. Why would Hoover need to perform such maneuvers, you might ask? The thing is, much of the information was obtained through not entirely legal means, such as unauthorized wiretapping. Telling everything through Valachi was ideal for Hoover. According to this version, FBI agents learned about the Mafia's setup from Scarpa, who was much closer to the top as a captain, and then provided this information to Valachi to reveal to the world. Hoover's ultimate goal in this game was to increase funding for the FBI. Agents supplied Valachi with all the necessary data, leading the country to learn about the true power of the Cosa Nostra through him. And in turn, the state gave Hoover more money to fight organized crime. Whether this was true or not, we won't delve into it, leaving these thoughts to you, our viewers. Instead, as always, we will stick to the facts that are indisputable and important for today's story. Scarpa's collaboration with the FBI. Let's go back to that. His collaboration can be roughly divided into official and unofficial. The former included all reports and data that came from Scarpa through his supervising agent to FBI headquarters. As payment, Scarpa would receive official regular payments and bonuses from the FBI for his services. The latter included secret missions that Greg carried out for the FBI, illegal deeds he engaged in with his supervising agent, and the protection he received when facing prison sentences. Let's be frank, the first part is boring and not particularly interesting to talk about. We will return to it when discussing how Scarpa fought for power by using official reports to divert suspicions or remove other mafiosi from his path. For now, let's focus on the second part and start with the secret missions. According to Scarpa himself, as conveyed through the stories of those close to him who knew about his work for the FBI, he had quite a few special operations. He claimed he helped the government frame members of the Israeli Mossad, assisted in some Kia special operations, gathered information on Howard Hughes and his mafia connections, and even tortured people. However, we only know details about one of his secret missions for the government, which did indeed involve torture. Were all the others true? I cannot confirm these incidents. The mentioned torture case involved the killing of 3 civil rights activists, Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman, by the Ku Klux Klan in Ohio during the summer of 1964. When they disappeared without a trace, public outrage ensued. The FBI took over the investigation, but despite their efforts, they couldn't find the boys dead or alive. The Bureau suspected the involvement of the Klan but couldn't prove anything. That's when Greg Scarpa was brought in. Scarpa abducted one of the Klan members and took him to a house deep in the woods. Inside the house, Scarpa started beating the man and demanded to know what happened to the missing boys. Whenever the captive provided some information, Scarpa would go outside and pass it on to the FBI agents waiting outside. They would verify the information, and if the man lied, the torture continued. The captive only gave up when Scarpa began cutting off his genitals. He confessed to all those involved in the deaths of the 3 boys and revealed where the bodies were buried. In the end, the FBI gained fame and honor, and Scarpa received several commendations and had all his expenses covered. The man who was kidnapped was not believed by anyone when he claimed he was tortured by some rogue sadist in the FBI's service. Scarpa's main mistress, Linda Shiro, also accompanied him on this mission. Greg had a total of 3 constant women: his wife, Connie, Linda, and the beauty queen from Israel, Lily Jani. However, Linda always remained the primary one. It must be said that she and Scarpa made a good couple. Scarpa met her shortly before the mission we talked about earlier, when he was around 40 years old and she had just turned 18. Initially, their relationship was like something out of a romantic movie. However, Linda started feeling restricted in her role as the mistress. She wanted Greg to divorce his wife. Scarpa had no intention of doing that, but he was willing to live together with Linda and start a family without getting legally married. This didn't satisfy Linda. She was Catholic and wanted their children to be baptized according to all the rules, with both a father and a mother. When she couldn't convince Greg to divorce his wife, she decided to marry someone else. Her plan was as follows: find a gullible guy, charm him into marrying her, have children with Scarpa, baptize them, and then divorce the guy. In her view, this would satisfy all religious considerations. Scarpa had reservations about this idea, but he couldn't stop Linda from carrying out her plan. She proceeded with her plan regardless. The man she chose was named Charlie Shiro, and they got married in March 1968. Linda lived with Charlie, but spent all her free time with Greg. Scarpa would often be at the Shiro family home when Charlie was at work. Linda would disappear for days at a time without explaining much to her husband. For a while, Charlie made excuses for the chaos around him, but this situation couldn't last forever. He eventually found out about the affair after the birth of their first child, who was, of course, Greg's. Despite knowing about Greg's reputation, Charlie couldn't take any action. He simply waited for Linda to tire of playing this game, which eventually happened after the birth of Greg's second child. Linda decided it wasn't worth continuing the charade and divorced Charlie. If you think their personal lives became more traditional after that, you'd be mistaken. Greg found himself another mistress, Lily Dujani, and Linda decided she deserved a lover on the side as well, preferably someone young and energetic to make their infidelity worth it. Whether this constituted true infidelity in the traditional sense is hard to say. Linda told Greg about her plan to see other people on the side. He didn't object. They both concluded that Linda had the right to explore this, believing it could bring new emotions to their intimate lives. This time, Linda chose a man named Larry Mazza, who delivered groceries to their home. It wasn't difficult for Linda to seduce him, and soon they became lovers. Linda would tell him her husband wasn't home, and they would indulge freely. Often, this was a lie, with Scarpa in another room. After Mazza left, Greg and Linda, excited by what had transpired, would become intimate themselves. At some point, Linda thought it would be beneficial for Greg and Charlie to meet in person, so that Scarpa could assist her lover with work, as he wasn't satisfied with his job as a courier. Under a pretext manufactured for Mazza, this meeting took place, and Scarpa offered him a new opportunity. He sponsored Larry, who then opened a betting station for an illegal lottery. Gradually, Scarpa involved Mazza more in his illegal activities, eventually making him one of the hitmen on his team. The issue of Mazza's relationship with Linda was openly discussed with him, as it deeply troubled Mazza. He even feared that the meeting where Scarpa addressed it would be his last, but he was fortunate. This unconventional love triangle lasted for about 15 years. In addition to Mazza, Scarpa also introduced his elder son, Gregory Scarpa Jr., whom I'll refer to as Junior, into the criminal world. From a young age, Junior witnessed the world his father belonged to, as Scarpa and his associates often gathered at their home to discuss matters or divide the spoils. While Junior didn't fully understand everything, he sensed something ominous in Scarpa's world. When Junior was a teenager, Scarpa revealed his true identity to him during a walk, explaining that he was involved in the Mafia and also worked for the government, portraying it as a service to the country. Scarpa likened himself to something akin to James Bond, which left a lasting impression on the young teenager. It was during this time that Scarpa began to introduce violence into his son's life. For instance, when Junior was 15, he got into a fight in a bar with an older man. Scarpa found out about it, took his son, and together they went to the bar. Scarpa brutally assaulted the man and then made his son kick the unconscious body. About a year later, Junior participated in a boxing competition where he lost a tough fight by decision. Scarpa then forced him to locate and beat up his opponent outside the ring. Junior couldn't find the guy, but this incident vividly illustrates the kind of upbringing Scarpa provided. Greg couldn't bear the thought of anyone being stronger than his son or disrespecting him, so he compelled Junior to adopt the same attitude. As Junior came of age, Scarpa began involving him in his illegal activities, gradually introducing discussion about killings. Scarpa gave him detailed instructions on how to execute killings effectively, dispose of bodies, and avoid getting caught. Although Junior wasn't comfortable with these conversations, his loyalty to his father kept him from objecting. Soon, this loyalty led him to be responsible for dozens of his own killings, with Greg Scarpa, SAR, orchestrating most of them. As mentioned earlier, Junior was aware that Scarpa worked for the FBI. His first handler was an agent named Anthony Villano. Scarpa informed his team that he had a contact in law enforcement, but didn't specify who or where exactly. Naturally, everyone assumed it was a local police officer whom they occasionally needed to pay off. In reality, it was an FBI agent, and there is substantial evidence that Scarpa regularly provided him with money. To mention, they sometimes collaborated. For instance, Scarpa's men might steal 100 cases of whiskey. Scarpa would take his cut of 20 cases and then inform Villano of the remaining stash. With this tip-off, Villano could approach those accountable for covering the losses, often insurance companies. He would negotiate, informing them he knew the whereabouts of a batch of whiskey valued at $60,000, but would only disclose the location for $110,000. To minimize costs, companies typically complied. Furthermore, the FBI would investigate the theft, and Scarpa would receive a government bonus for the valuable intelligence. From one theft, Greg gained a share of the stolen goods, money from the insurance company, and a government bonus, despite sharing with Villano. It was a remarkably effective plan, as reliable as Swiss watches. There's also unconfirmed information that Villano, and later his successor Lindo, were implicated in thefts. This speculation suggests that during activities like bank break-ins, the FBI agent would be stationed in a car, monitoring details on special radio waves known to authorities. If the agent caught wind that police had detected suspicious activity at the bank, he promptly alerted Scarpa's associates. However, direct involvement of FBI agents in Scarpa's affairs, if it occurred, wasn't widespread. They covered for him and received payments, but not all agents were implicated. Scarpa also managed separate operations. Firstly, the claims about FBI agent involvement lack verification, and secondly, even if true, it wasn't universal. Scarpa's theft team operated consistently, targeting banks and jewelry stores. The crew even had their own innovations. One member devised a lockpick that easily cracked open phone booth coin compartments. Scarpa himself sometimes practiced these techniques. His theft operation was highly exclusive. Among roughly 50 members in the so-called Wimpy Boys team, named after Scarpa's social club, approximately 10 could be considered professional thieves. Another 10 to 15 served as hired hitmen, juggling other jobs and sources of income, though their primary task was often elimination. Even more exclusive was the group specializing in luxury car theft. Scarpa's associates made these cars untraceable and profitable to resell. Similarly skilled were those targeting trucks carrying various goods, from clothes to electronics and food. They could earn between $5,000 to $10,000 per truck, depending on its contents. Others were involved in illegal lotteries, bookmaking, and loan sharking, all paying a percentage to Scarpa. For instance, he provided $80,000 to loan sharks for street lending, collecting $100 per week for every $10,000 lent out. The loan sharks themselves could earn $300 to $400 on the same amount, making it a lucrative enterprise, especially given Scarpa's reputation and the certainty of collections. Continuing the list, one cannot overlook the presence of drug traffickers who operated within Scarpa's team, with even Junior involved in this illicit trade. Among the most notorious groups in Greg's organization were the Muscles, strongmen specialized in intimidation. If a debtor failed to repay a loan or a businessman refused extortion demands, these individuals were dispatched, known for their expertise in breaking limbs and instilling fear. As evidenced, Scarpa and his team were involved in nearly every avenue of illicit profit, including fraud. Greg took particular pleasure in credit card fraud, acquiring duplicate cards that his associates used for purchases. The goods bought were resold for cash or used for everyday expenses, such as groceries or dining out. This fraudulent activity generated hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. For instance, in 1985, an agent of the United States Secret Service covertly sold 300 credit cards to Scarpa's operation. Greg could have made over $1 million if he had used all 300 credit cards bought from a Secret Service agent for $99,000. Instead, Greg faced fraud charges that carried a potential sentence of 7 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. However, the FBI intervened and discovered that Scarpa had not paid the $99,000, but only considered the purchase. The judge also considered Scarpa's role as an informant, and authorities decided to spare him. Greg received only a 5-year suspended sentence and a $10,000 fine. By the time of this incident, Scarpa's FBI handler had changed from Villano to Dito. Villano stopped working with Scarpa in the mid-1970s due to an internal investigation that resulted in his transfer from New York and subsequent retirement. Scarpa, meanwhile, had ceased his collaboration with the FBI in 1975. However, in 1980, he was convinced to return by Agent Lynn Dito, whom Greg quickly persuaded to collaborate with him, much like Villano. Scarpa provided Dito with information about individuals who obstructed his rise to power or posed a threat within the American Mafia. Dito, in turn, shielded Scarpa from legal repercussions, and according to some accounts, indirectly aided in several of Scarpa's murders. Typically, Dito would provide intelligence on targets' locations or alert Scarpa when someone planned to cooperate with authorities. For instance, this was evident in the case of Scarpa's close associate Joe Brewster. When Dito learned that Brewster intended to speak to the police, a move that could endanger both Scarpa and Dito, Scarpa ordered Brewster's assassination. Scarpa and Dito quickly found common ground and shared a goal where violence and abuse of authority were acceptable means. Their objective was clear: to enhance Scarpa's influence within the Mafia, thereby advancing Dito's career as well. Ultimately, they aimed to install Scarpa or his proxy as the boss of the Colombo family, placing an informant at the highest echelon of the American Mafia, potentially facilitating the downfall of numerous criminal enterprises. The entire organization operated like a house of cards. To substantiate these claims, let's consider a few concrete examples of this duplicity. We'll start with how Scarpa got rid of Charlie. As mentioned at the very beginning, when Charlie wielded significant influence in the Colombo family, Scarpa spoke favorably of him in reports to the FBI, even while providing information about his crimes. However, as Charlie began losing power and hitting rock bottom, Scarpa's rhetoric changed. He started almost insulting Charlie in his reports to the agents. This shift was part of a very calculated game. Recognizing Charlie's weakness, Greg began plotting a cunning conspiracy against him. Pay attention now. Scarpa slowly started feeding the FBI information about Charlie's deteriorating relationships with his sons. Then Greg either struck a deal with Charlie's grandson, Richard, or simply robbed him. While Richard was at work, transporting company stocks worth hundreds of thousands of dollars from one place to another, Scarpa told the FBI that he had nothing to do with it, but knew where some of the stocks were kept. The agents found them there. Scarpa also implied that Charlie might have been behind the robbery because one of Charlie's men contacted Greg with an offer to buy the stocks. Richard was summoned to answer questions before a grand jury. Sometime later, Richard was found dead. Immediately after his death, the chief assistant district attorney in Brooklyn, Elliot Golden, named Richard a star witness, thus confirming the motive for his murder and fears that he had started cooperating with the authorities. The primary suspicion in the murder fell on Charlie. Later, it became known that Scarpa was aware of the illegal dealings between Golden and Joe Colombo. Although there's no direct evidence of this, one could speculate that he may have pressured Golden to make a statement about the star witness, thereby justifying the motive for Richard's murder by Charlie. When the entire web was woven, Charlie himself was killed, and all suspicions fell on his son Frank, who supposedly avenged Richard's death. Thus, Scarpa removed the final piece from the board. First, Scarpa removed the old man who knew too much about him, but had now hit rock bottom, making his actions unpredictable. Now let's turn to Joe Colombo. If the setup with Charlie was more for personal safety, the situation with Colombo was more about a power struggle. Scarpa acted more discreetly here, employing a strategy akin to water slowly eroding concrete, eventually punching a hole through it. In simpler terms, he seized every opportunity to undermine Colombo. In 1967, Scarpa informed the FBI of the location of Colombo's son's wedding, allowing undercover agents to capture several new faces. A year later, Scarpa reported Colombo's son for planning to melt down silver coins and sell them as precious metal at a higher value than their nominal worth. When Colombo's son was arrested, Joe staged a multi-day protest, and Scarpa helped him with that while simultaneously keeping the FBI informed of Colombo's plans. Scarpa was also one of the most active members of the Italian-American Civil Rights League, supposedly working for the organization's interests. The Italian-American Civil Rights League, established by Colombo to protect the rights of Italian Americans, further cemented Scarpa's relationship with the boss. After that, information began to flow to the FBI about Colombo's earnings and the corrupt connections he had at his disposal. Now, we approach a very interesting version of why and by whom Joe Colombo was killed. This occurred at a rally organized by Colombo in the summer of 1971. He was shot by a black man named Jerome Johnson, which led to Colombo falling into a lengthy coma and later dying. I've already discussed two main versions of this incident in my videos. One blames Joe Gallo, while the other blames Carlo Gambino. It is generally believed that it was indeed Gambino. More details about this can be found in my video about Carlo Gambino and the Gallo brothers. Scarpa initially pushed the FBI's version that it was Joe Gallo. At first, he said that all was well between Colombo and Gallo, but shortly before the assassination, he radically changed his opinion and started to say that a war might break out soon. He mentioned that Colombo feared an attack, citing as evidence a car with African Americans circulating in his neighborhood. Scarpa told the agents that Colombo believed these individuals were friends of Joe Gallo, whom he had befriended in prison. Moreover, after the assassination, Scarpa was able to tell the FBI a surprising amount about the shooter, even though neither the police nor other informants knew much about Johnson. All of this raises the idea that Colombo might have been killed by Scarpa, who then shifted all the blame onto Joe Gallo. However, these are only speculations, as the evidence in this regard is too indirect. What we do know for certain is that after Colombo's death, Scarpa immediately shifted his focus to Carmine Persico, who would later become the new boss of the family. The first thing Scarpa did was accuse Persico of killing Joe Gallo, but that was just the beginning. Multiple bosses being imprisoned due to a conspiracy known as the Concrete Club. The essence of this scheme was that mobsters from different families conspired to take over the construction industry in New York, extorting money from construction firms. Scarpa also provided the FBI with an address where members of the Colombo family, Soldier Ralph Scopo, Underboss Gennaro Langella, and Captain Dominic Montemarano, were discussing matters related to the Concrete Club. FBI agents installed listening devices there. These recordings, among others, led to the arrest of the mobsters, as well as the family boss Carmine Persico, who ended up in prison for 100 years in the late 1980s. With a couple of informants and the help of others, Scarpa quickly eliminated 3 higher-ranking members of the family. However, he had no intention of stopping, even though by that time he was fatally ill. The illness began with persistent back pain, the cause of which was unknown, but Greg fought it by regularly taking painkillers. This, in turn, led to gastrointestinal diseases, culminating in internal bleeding. In 1986, doctors performed an operation and saved Scarpa's life, but he also needed a blood transfusion. Familiar acquaintances and associates of Greg became donors, among them a 29-year-old bodybuilder named Paul May. Shortly after the blood transfusion, May passed away. It turned out that he had contracted AIDS from intramuscular injections of anabolic steroids, using the same needle as several other bodybuilders. His weakened immune system couldn't fight off pneumonia. Scarpa then got tested, and the results were bleak. He was also infected. He fought the disease as best he could, but it inexorably took its toll. Nevertheless, this did not stop him from continuing to scheme and kill people. By the early 1990s, Scarpa found himself in the leading role in the bloodiest mafia war of that decade, named the Third Colombo War. The most common version of its beginning suggests that the acting boss, Vic Orena, decided to rebel against Carmine Persico, who was the true boss and was incarcerated. However, there is another version where Scarpa is depicted as the mastermind behind the conflict, deliberately instigating tensions and manipulating both sides to further his own agenda. Scarpa was the puppet master who initiated this war. Orena was the antithesis of Scarpa. He made his money mostly from non-violent crimes and was against the drug trade. He was also loyal to the Persico faction of the family for most of his mafia career, and Carmine trusted him so much that he made him his acting boss when he went to prison in the late 1980s for the Mafia Commission trial. Scarpa didn't like this arrangement, so he started to get closer to Orena on the one hand, while on the other hand, making it seem like Vic believed in him so much that he wanted to betray Persico and take full power into his own hands. Scarpa carried out his plan with the help of a guy named Hugh Casso, who had been working with his team as a partner for a long time. Scarpa first lobbied for Casso's admission into the family, where he was placed on Vic Orena's team. As Casso grew closer to Orena, Scarpa had his eyes and ears in the camp of his main opponent in the power struggle. Casso played his role so skillfully that Orena started to trust him a lot and helped him with his career. In the Mafia too, thus, with one secret and one obvious patron, Caesar went from a soldier to a consigliere in a matter of years. However, it should be noted that Scarpa's loyalty was based more on fear than on love. On the one hand, Caesar did have a good relationship with Orena. Vic even helped him distance himself from Scarpa. But Greg scared Caesar too much for him to break the bond completely. Additionally, rumors were constantly circulating in the Mafia that Scarpa was an informant. No one could prove anything, but that scared Caesar too, for Greg knew where the bodies of the people Caesar had killed on his orders were hidden. Scarpa realized that fear alone would not be enough to make Caesar go against Orena. Caesar had gotten too close to him, and it would be foolish to dismiss the possibility that he might betray Greg. Nevertheless, Scarpa had already decided to get Vic out of his way and started weaving his web again. Angelina, to poll the captains on whether they supported Persico's rule. When Angelina did so, Orena eliminated him. It would later turn out that Angelina was killed for a different reason, generally on the orders of Persico himself. However, when sometime later, Caesar was appointed consigliere and Orena asked him to make the same inquiry, Caesar became nervous. Scarpa, on the other hand, added fuel to the fire by telling him that he had heard Caesar was being prepared to be assassinated when he went to the ceremony for accepting new members, which he, as consigliere, was obliged to attend. Eventually, Caesar, under pressure from Scarpa, decided to kill Orena. But the attempt was unsuccessful. After this, the family split into two factions. One sided with Orena and the other with Persico, who by this time was convinced that Orina was indeed plotting a coup. There were talks for a while, both between the factions and with other families. But in November 1991, there was a complete assassination attempt on Scarpa, signaling the start of a full-scale war. Greg himself was involved in 4 murders in this confrontation. Despite looking more like a walking skeleton due to advanced aids, he traveled around New York with a gun, seeking out enemies and mercilessly shooting and killing them. However, Orina was still alive, and then Scarpa began to realize his other plan. If he couldn't kill Vic, he decided to put him away, especially since the groundwork for this was already laid. This plan centered around the murder of Tommy Osera, for which Orina was eventually imprisoned. Osera was killed by Scarpa because Tommy suspected that Greg was an informant and started discussing it with other gangsters. We know this from the testimony of Greg Scarpa Jr. It's also known that when the Colombo War broke out and it became clear that Scarpa couldn't kill Orina directly, he planted the guns from that crime on Vic. This move initiated Orina's apprehension. In fact, Vic was convicted based on circumstantial evidence, rumors, hearsay, and a weapon that was planted on him, devoid of fingerprints. After his imprisonment, the war stopped, and so did Scarpa's multi-pronged scheme. Before I tell you about the fall of the Grim Reaper, as Greg was called, I want to take a moment to discuss the murders he committed, as this aspect is crucial in understanding his character. We've previously discussed the murders of Charlie and Joe Brewster, as well as the 4 killings during the Colombo's Third War. However, Scarpa didn't stop there. There was also Dominic Suma, who complained to family captain Anthony Scarpa about Scarpa Jr. being insubordinate during a heist. Greg remembered this and patiently waited for Sumer to make a mistake so he could obtain permission from the family boss to kill him. When the opportunity arose, Scarpa pulled the trigger himself. Additionally, there was his mistress Lily, the John's lover, who was planning to talk to the Ayers about Scarpa and their joint business interests. Greg personally shot her. There was also a man in his social club who owed money to his loan shark. And another time he killed a regular limousine driver for insulting Scarpa Jr. Greg also killed another driver when he found out he was trying to molest his daughter. I've chosen these examples out of about 24 murders attributed to Scarpa to show you that Greg could kill for just about anything, from a power struggle to a simple insult. The next 2 examples are meant to demonstrate that for his own safety, he could go to the extent of killing even those closest to him. The first example is the death of Scarpa's older brother, Salvatore. By the end of the 1980s, their relationship wasn't the best. Salvatore, seeing how his brother repeatedly evaded accusations, the latest of which was an almost assured case involving credit cards, began to speak about suspecting Greg of working for the government. Scarpa killed him for this. The second example is Gus Farasi, who was Scarpa's nephew. He was quite close to Greg and worked on his crew. However, when Farasi killed a Drug Enforcement Administration agent, Scarpa publicly distanced himself from him in an interview, fearing that such a connection could harm him. As Farasi was a major target for law enforcement agencies, several New York Mafia families were interested in his murder, and Scarpa either helped them find his nephew or killed him himself. Greg was never punished for any of these murders, all thanks to his FBI guardian angel, Lynn Dito. However, Dito was not omnipotent, and his subordinates were beginning to suspect more and more that their boss was not just supervising their most valuable informant, but was playing a double game. Agent Chris Favo proved to be the most incredulous. He had long suspected Dito, but he was finally convinced when the loan shark, Carmine Imbali, was arrested. Imbali began to cooperate with the authorities and revealed that he had heard Scarpa bragging at dinner about killing a man. Prosecutor's office, to whom Imbali told this, passed the information to Chris Favo, who reported it to Dito. Within a couple of days, Imbali said there was a rumor on the streets that Scarpa wanted to kill him. Favo easily traced the pattern here, but couldn't believe it yet. Final straw for Favo, which tipped the scales toward refusing to trust his boss, was a conversation with Dito after the murder of Arena supporter Larry Lampassi. When Favo informed Dito of this, he replied, "Yeah, we're definitely going to win." It wasn't hard to guess that Dito was specifically referring to the war in the Colombo family. As an FBI agent and the superior overseeing teams capturing members of the Bonanno and Colombo families, he had no business empathizing with anyone in an armed conflict. This clearly indicated that Dito was engaged and taking Scarpa's side. Favo began to act without consulting Dito as much as possible. He installed listening devices in the home and car of Scarpa's team member, Joseph Ambrosino. Those recordings helped link Scarpa to 2 murders and 1 attempted murder. In March 1992, the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office obtained an arrest warrant for Scarpa on charges of weapon possession after 2 officers witnessed him dropping a gun from his car window. Dito was with Scarpa during this period but did not arrest him or inform the prosecution of his whereabouts. Meanwhile, Favo, circumventing Dito, obtained an arrest warrant for Scarpa for conspiring to commit murder. At the same time, Favo received it and began watching Greg completely, unsuspectingly, assured by Dito that everything was fine and he had nothing to worry about. First, Scarpa appeared in court over an issue with poorly sanitized blood at a hospital that infected him with AIDS, where he won $350,000. He then attended the court proceedings for illegal possession of a firearm. It was here that Favo arrested him as he left the courtroom. By that time, Scarpa's health was terrible, and he looked like a walking skeleton. His imprisonment only worsened his condition. He lost more weight, showed signs of dementia and other mental impairments, and it became increasingly difficult for him to move each day. His relatives managed to have Greg placed under house arrest due to his health. However, Scarpa wouldn't be himself if he complied with the rules of his house arrest. One day, his son Joseph, from Linda, told him about an altercation he had with 2 drug dealers. Joseph was involved in drugs, and the argument was business related. Greg refused to listen. He grabbed a gun, got into the car with his son and his friend, and went to find these guys. Upon finding them, Scarpa initiated a shootout in which he himself lost an eye and his son's friend died. After this incident, he was returned to prison. Scarpa didn't defend himself in court. On May 6, 1993, Greg Scarpa Jr. pleaded guilty to 3 counts of murder and conspiracy to commit more murders. He faced a life sentence without parole. However, considering his health, the judge sentenced him to 10 years in prison. In his final years, Greg Scarpa Sr. was bedridden, his body scarred and suffering, making even eating and drinking painful. He passed away on June 4, 1994. After his death, Linda Shiro received no support from the Colombo family. There were rumors that she had developed a romantic relationship, but these remain unconfirmed. Lynn Dito's fate took an unexpected turn. Despite suspicions reported by Favo, an FBI internal investigation found no grounds for further action. Dito quietly retired after 30 years with the Bureau, escaping any consequences for alleged connections with Greg Scarpa. Greg Scarpa Jr., imprisoned since 1988, spent over 3 decades in Aix Florence, one of the strictest U.S. prisons. Released in 2020, his life had been marked by violence and crime. This concludes the story of Greg Scarpa, Sr., a figure whose life and actions were entwined with the dark underbelly of organized crime. If you enjoyed the story of the enigmatic Greg Scarpa, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more gripping tales from history's underworld. Stay tuned for our next episode. Thank you for watching.